They call it the world's most dangerous border. But what happens when the sparks turn into fire? When rhetoric turns into retaliation? When a decades-old powder keg, long smoldering under the icy winds of geopolitics, finally explodes? And it's not just two nations at stake, but the very supply chains, food routes, and global balance that many take for granted? How close are we, really, to witnessing the collapse of Asian stability? And with it, the first domino in a global recession. Before we dive into the commentary, please like and subscribe to Worldview Today so you won't miss our unique takes on global current affairs. The conflict between India and Pakistan is not new. It's a scar on the map of South Asia, carved by partition and sustained by blood, betrayal, and bombs. But something feels different this time. The recent attack in Pahalgam, a picturesque corner of Kashmir, left 26 tourists dead and set off a cascade of retaliatory strikes. As New Delhi launched precision airstrikes into Pakistani territory and Islamabad vowed retribution, analysts worldwide began to brace for what might come next. Not a full-blown nuclear exchange, necessarily, but a sustained regional conflict with ripple effects felt across continents. It begins, as always, with borders. The Kashmir region, split and contested, is the heart of this old wound. And it is within this crucible of nationalist fervor and geopolitical rivalry that modern militaries now flex new muscles. India's deployment of Rafale jets, modern, French-made multi-role fighters, paired with advanced cruise missiles like the Storm Shadow, has brought a chilling level of precision and range to its tactical options. These aren't just warning shots across the border, they are messages, loud, expensive, and unmistakably strategic. But Pakistan, too, is not posturing in silence. Its aging but still potent fleet of F-16s, provided by the United States, remains the centerpiece of its air deterrence. These jets, despite their contractual limitations and American-imposed monitoring, have historically been used in ways that raise eyebrows in Washington. In the 2019 dogfight, Pakistani F-16s reportedly fired AIM-120C5 missiles, restricted American munitions, during an aerial clash that downed an Indian MiG-21. The evidence recovered from missile fragments sparked international scrutiny and fresh questions about Pakistan's compliance with U.S. arms control clauses. And yet, here we are again, with air forces scrambling, missiles flying, and both sides locked in a deadly choreography of retaliation and denial. This time, it's not just national security on the line. It's regional connectivity, it's food security, it's global trade. Consider this. Malaysia imports roughly 40% of its rice from India and Pakistan. Indonesia relies heavily on Indian grain to supplement its domestic shortages. If this conflict drags out, if borders are sealed tighter, if infrastructure is targeted, if farmers in the Punjab or Sindh can't sow or transport grain, what happens to Southeast Asia's dinner table? It's not hyperbole, it's economics, it's supply chains, and it's happening as the global economy already teeters on the edge. The post-COVID recovery remains uneven. Shipping routes are still recalibrating. Inflationary pressures have not fully subsided. Now add a war, however contained, in a region that serves as a critical trade hub between East and West, and you've got a recipe for disruption that extends far beyond subcontinental grievances. Analysts have been quick to warn of the potential economic blowback. Michael Clackey, a defense expert cited by Sky News, points out that the world economy is already fragile. Even a localized war in Asia could sever logistics networks, frighten investors, and accelerate what many fear is an imminent global downturn. If this escalates, Clackey says, we're looking at recession scenarios not just for Asia, but for interconnected economies worldwide. But the battlefield isn't just commercial, it's also infrastructural. India and Pakistan are nodes in major transcontinental corridors. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, and the International North-South Transport Corridor, INSTC, are massive projects that link China, Central Asia, Russia, the Middle East, and Europe. A prolonged conflict in South Asia puts all of them at risk. Imagine the implications. shipments rerouted, timelines delayed, and billions in investment jeopardized. All because two nuclear powers can't de-escalate over a patch of mountainous terrain and a long chain of historical grievances. And then there's the shadow war, the terror dimension. Groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and even foreign actors like ISIS-K are watching the situation closely. For them, chaos is opportunity. A border conflict offers more than just a distraction. It opens recruitment channels, propaganda moments, and the loosening of state grip on porous frontiers. Already, intelligence reports warn that groups across Central Asia are increasing activity. The longer India and Pakistan clash, the greater the risk that terrorism, like a virus, metastasizes into neighboring regions. And while Islamabad insists it had no hand in the Pahalgam attack, India is unconvinced. Their retaliatory strikes have specifically targeted camps they say are harboring terrorist elements. And they've done so with lethal efficiency, using drones, loitering munitions, GPS-guided smart bombs, and stealth aircraft. The days of carpet bombing are gone. Now it's about surgical precision, optics, and plausible deniability. But in the fog of war, truth becomes another casualty. Pakistan has claimed to shoot down multiple Indian aircraft, including one helicopter, and even struck command posts across the border. India has denied these losses while insisting their own raids were limited in scope and avoided civilian infrastructure. But satellite imagery, released by U.S. private firm Massa Technologies, tells a more sobering story. Multiple sites, both military and religious, show structural damage. At what point does tit-for-tat become an unbreakable cycle? That question is starting to haunt policymakers in Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. Because this isn't just about Kashmir, it's about perception, it's about strategic alliances, and it's about who will shape the next balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. India has grown closer to the West, especially the United States, in recent years. Defense pacts, joint exercises, and arms deals have flourished. The recent delivery of advanced IGLA-S air defense systems from Russia, along with other purchases, suggests New Delhi is also hedging its bets, playing both sides in the great game of 21st century realignment. Pakistan, meanwhile, leans increasingly toward Beijing. Chinese-supplied JF-17 fighters supplement their aging fleets. The economic reliance on China, via CPEC investments, is deepening despite financial strains. And yet, Islamabad remains wary of being a pawn. It knows that a full-scale war with India could alienate both creditors and allies. In this sense, the air war is only half the story. The other half plays out in conference rooms, in embassy cables, in the cold arithmetic of GDP forecasts and logistics reports. That's where the real danger lies. Not in the explosions, but in the slow unraveling of regional order. Because when two nuclear states stare each other down over an alleged cross-border attack, and the world's response is silence or mild rebuke, what message does that send to other regions simmering with tension? It sends the message that might makes right. That if you are nuclear armed and determined, red lines can be crossed without immediate consequence. And in a world already fraying at the seams, with tensions in the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, Ukraine, and the Middle East, the India-Pakistan conflict could become a dangerous precedent, or worse, a model. Let's examine the deeper interests behind this new wave of escalation. What does each side truly want? India, under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, has pursued a doctrine of muscular nationalism. The Modi administration views assertive military posture not only as deterrence, but as domestic political capital. Every strike on alleged terrorist camps across the line of control earns applause from a nationalist base and reinforces India's self-image as a rising power that will not be bullied. The internal logic is clear. In a volatile democracy, strength is currency. Especially in a year shadowed by inflationary worries, border skirmishes with China, and discontent among India's vast youth population, foreign enemies offer convenient distractions and opportunities to project authority. But this is not mere political theater. India's military buildup, its investments in French Rafale jets, Russian missile systems, and U.S. defense coordination under Quad exercises reflect a real strategic ambition to assert regional dominance not just over Pakistan, but also as a counterweight to China's expanding footprint. For Pakistan, the calculus is different, but no less fraught. Its economy teeters on the brink. Debt obligations are mounting, IMF negotiations are ongoing, and inflation is crushing the average citizen. In this context, military escalation, especially one cast as defensive, serves as a unifying force. It rekindles nationalist pride, distracts from economic malaise, and justifies increased defense spending even as civilian programs face cuts. But there's also another layer, more precarious and potentially destabilizing: the military-civilian dynamic in Islamabad. Pakistan's military has long held sway over foreign and security policy, and episodes of heightened tension with India tend to shift more power into its hands. A protracted standoff, then, might not only reshape regional alliances, but also tilt the internal political balance within Pakistan itself, possibly sidelining civilian oversight at a critical economic juncture. And then there is the nuclear shadow. Both nations possess nuclear arsenals. India, with an estimated 160 warheads, Pakistan with around 170 to 200. These are not merely symbolic deterrents. They are operational, mobile, and integrated into their respective military doctrines. While India maintains a declared no-first-use policy, Pakistan has always kept its posture deliberately ambiguous. This ambiguity is strategic. It is meant to deter a conventionally superior India from ever considering a full invasion or punitive campaign. But the cost of such a policy is perpetual uncertainty. Every cross-border airstrike, every mobilization, every downed aircraft brings the subcontinent one step closer to miscalculation. And in a scenario where minutes matter and political leaders are under pressure to save face, that's a razor's edge the world should fear. Yet what makes this particular moment more dangerous than previous episodes is the technological evolution. Precision strike weapons like the Scalp cruise missile, loitering munitions, and real-time drone surveillance give each side the illusion of control. The illusion that war can be fought with scalpel-like precision, minimizing blowback. But war, once unleashed, is rarely controllable. We've seen this in the escalating tit-for-tat. The strike on Pahalgam, the Indian air raids on alleged terrorist facilities, Pakistan's retaliation on Indian command posts, claims of downed jets and destroyed headquarters. Neither side has shown a willingness to de-escalate, and the digital age complicates things further. Satellite images, social media footage, and breaking news blur the line between truth and propaganda. In an environment saturated with data but lacking in trust, each side's narrative becomes gospel to its own people and suspect to its adversaries. Meanwhile, the civilians pay the price. In Kashmir, divided and militarized, residents brace for nightly raids, power outages, and rising food prices. Border villages evacuate, farmers flee their land, children sleep in bunkers. A generation grows up knowing more about air raid sirens than playgrounds. But the impact doesn't end in the Himalayas. In Singapore, in Kuala Lumpur, in Jakarta, planners are reviewing rice import forecasts. Insurance premiums on cargo ships inch upward. Investors, already jittery over China's slowdown and U.S. political volatility, add South Asia to their watch lists. And in the Gulf, where millions of Indian and Pakistani workers reside, there are worries about communal unrest. Past flare-ups between the two nations have triggered clashes in expatriate communities from Dubai to Riyadh. In a world already polarized by religion, ethnicity, and economic hardship, the India-Pakistan conflict could act as an accelerant. Consider also the strategic corridors at risk. The China-Pakistan economic corridor, worth tens of billions of dollars, runs through contested territory. If missiles fall near CPEC assets, Beijing will be forced to choose: remain silent or risk involvement. Similarly, the international North-South transport corridor, linking India, Iran, Russia, and Central Asia, could be disrupted if hostilities cross into Afghanistan or Western Pakistan. These are not theoretical consequences. They are logistical, financial, and political realities that could reshape the region's trade routes for years. Washington, too, is watching closely. The United States has cultivated stronger ties with India in recent years, viewing it as a key pillar of its Indo-Pacific strategy. At the same time, it continues to maintain leverage over Pakistan through arms sales and security aid, including a recent USD $397 million package aimed at ensuring U.S. oversight of the F-16 fleet. But with accusations of misuse already surfacing, Washington's credibility as an honest broker is being tested. There is also the broader question of deterrence credibility. If Pakistan is perceived to have violated U.S. end-use agreements by deploying F-16s and American missiles in ways contrary to contract, and the U.S. fails to respond, what signal does that send to other nations, particularly those eyeing arms deals with Washington's rivals? China, for its part, may prefer strategic ambiguity. Its investments in Pakistan are deep, but its trade with India is even deeper. In 2024, China-India trade crossed USD $130 billion, despite border disputes. In an ideal world, Beijing wants both countries stable and dependent. But instability is contagious. If war spills into CPEC territory, if Indian strikes threaten Chinese assets, or if terrorism resurges in Xinjiang as a result of regional chaos, Beijing may be forced off the sidelines. Russia is similarly caught in a balancing act. It sells arms to both countries. It cooperates with India under BRICS and with Pakistan in counter-terrorism drills. The Kremlin is unlikely to pick sides, but every diverted missile, every burning base, complicates its Eurasian ambitions. In Europe, the concern is more pragmatic. A major conflict in Asia would likely drive oil prices up, push inflation higher, and force the EU to recalibrate its already fragile trade forecasts. Add to that the refugee risk. If war drives millions from their homes in Kashmir and Punjab, neighboring countries could face humanitarian crises that ripple westward. Even Vietnam, quiet, neutral, focused on domestic growth, has reason to pay attention. As it seeks to diversify trade routes, participate in regional food networks, and avoid entanglements in great power rivalries, stability in South Asia becomes a key variable, and in this tightening web of consequence and calculation, perhaps the most chilling realization is that none of the global powers truly have control. The United Nations calls for restraint, but its resolutions are non-binding, its influence diluted. Regional bodies like SAARC are all but paralyzed. The United States is distracted by domestic polarization and looming elections. China is cautious, calculating each move through the prism of its own internal slowdown and international scrutiny. Russia is overstretched, still entangled in the consequences of its war in Ukraine. So, what happens when the rest of the world no longer has the will or the capacity to mediate between two nuclear-armed neighbors? We are watching in real time a case study in the failure of global crisis management. And the stakes are not only political or military, they're existential. India's decision to conduct a nationwide civil defense drill, the first of its kind in nearly half a century, is not mere symbolism. It's a sign of real fear. When 244 districts are instructed to run coordinated air raid rehearsals, test evacuation plans, and camouflage critical infrastructure, that's not theater. That's preparation. That's a government looking beyond diplomacy to survival. It speaks to a paradigm shift. In the past, India and Pakistan engaged in limited wars with tacit red lines. Even after Kargil in 1999, after the 2001 Parliament attack, after the 2008 Mumbai carnage, both sides returned to the table, reluctantly, but eventually. This time, however, the escalation has coincided with a dangerous alignment of factors: sophisticated weaponry, widespread nationalist sentiment, weakened international mediators, and overlapping strategic interests. And one must not ignore the political calendars. Modi's government, keen to preserve its image of strength, sees little incentive to appear passive. Sharif's coalition in Pakistan, under intense pressure from both the military and economic crisis, needs a nationalist cause to rally the public and suppress dissent. In such a climate, restraint is no longer a political asset, it's a liability. Meanwhile, technology has changed the tempo of war. Long-range missiles like the Scalp Hammer, loitering drones like the LMS, and real-time ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, networks have shortened the decision window from hours to minutes. In previous wars, commanders had time to verify intelligence, consult political leaders, and assess global reactions. Today, decisions are increasingly automated, algorithm-driven, or made under immense time pressure. What happens when an AI misidentifies a target? What if a hypersonic missile is mistaken for a nuclear one? What if a rogue commander, emboldened by ideology or isolated by communication breakdowns, launches a preemptive strike? These aren't theoretical questions anymore. They're plausible near-future scenarios, and the Indo-Pac theater may be where the world first learns just how quickly things can spiral. It's worth noting that nuclear arsenals in both countries are no longer just strategic. They're becoming tactical. Pakistan's NASR missile, with a range of just 70 kilometers, is explicitly designed for battlefield use. India, too, has hinted at operationalizing smaller warheads, presumably to signal readiness to respond proportionally to limited nuclear use. In theory, this creates flexibility. In reality, it normalizes the unthinkable. And here, global supply chains again become hostages. A war-induced disruption in the Indian subcontinent affects not just rice or textiles. It affects pharmaceuticals, as both nations are significant suppliers of generic drugs. It affects tech, with India's growing semiconductor ambitions and Pakistan's expanding digital economy. It affects logistics corridors from the Gulf to Southeast Asia, already strained by Red Sea piracy and overland bottlenecks in Central Asia. Investors are taking note. Insurance premiums for ships passing through the Arabian Sea are up. Risk assessments in Southeast Asia are being revised. Currency volatility is back in the spotlight. And once the perception of risk hardens, it's not easily undone. Even if the conflict de-escalates tomorrow, the economic aftershocks will linger. Supply contracts will be renegotiated. Infrastructure projects will face delays. Multinationals will rethink where they place critical infrastructure. And smaller nations, Vietnam, the Philippines, Bangladesh, will either suffer from spillover or capitalize on trade diversions. Which brings us back to a broader strategic point. In the 21st century, regional wars are global events. The West can no longer treat South Asia as a quarantined theater. What happens between New Delhi and Islamabad affects trade flows, investment climates, energy markets, and security paradigms from Canberra to Cairo. And yet, diplomacy remains tepid. The United States has issued the usual calls for restraint. China urges dialogue and stability. Russia offers mediation while selling arms to both sides. The EU, distracted by internal politics, has barely registered more than a concern. Perhaps the most glaring silence is from multilateral institutions. The UN Security Council, paralyzed by veto powers, has done little more than convene a closed-door meeting. SAARC, long crippled by India-Pakistan rivalry, has not met meaningfully in years. And ASEAN, though geographically close, views South Asia's crises as external. This fragmentation is dangerous. It signals to regional powers that escalation will not be met with coordinated international pushback. That's how dangerous precedents are set. That's how wars of choice become wars of attrition. And that's how deterrence begins to fail, not with a bang, but with diplomatic silence. Yet amid this geopolitical cacophony, we must not forget the human toll. In Kashmir, already one of the most militarized zones on Earth, civilian life is collapsing. Schools are closed. Hospitals are overrun. Roads are mined. Food supplies are running low. In border towns across Punjab and Azad Kashmir, families are packing their belongings, unsure if the next siren will be a drill or a death knell. And across the subcontinent, millions of people with roots in both nations are watching in horror. Families split by borders, businesses shuttered by embargoes, students stranded as visas are revoked, all casualties of a war that nobody wants, but few have the courage to stop. And this leads to a final, more unsettling question. If war does break out, full-scale, prolonged, even limited to conventional weapons, what does victory even look like? What does victory look like in a war between two nuclear nations, with economies already strained, populations deeply divided, and allies more interested in strategic positioning than peacekeeping? A few more square kilometers of contested land? A crumpled terrorist camp? A political speech thumping with national pride while the markets crash and foreign investors flee? In a war where no side can afford defeat, and yet neither side can define success, the only real winner is chaos. Even the most hardened defense analysts are now acknowledging that the India-Pakistan dynamic has entered a new phase, one where retaliation is more agile, escalation more digital, and consequences more distributed. The strike-counter-strike pattern has become faster, less predictable, and dangerously reliant on algorithmic decision-making. And behind every missile launch, every aerial duel, every fiery speech in parliament, the cost is paid in factories shut down, crops left unharvested, and the widening anxiety of an international community already fatigued by too many conflicts. India and Pakistan are not just two neighboring states. They are linchpins in the Asian economy, nodes in global logistics, and keystones in regional diplomacy. A war between them doesn't stay in Kashmir. It ripples out, to the Strait of Hormuz, to the ports of Singapore, to the refugee offices in Berlin. And while both sides have declared that nuclear weapons remain weapons of last resort, the normalization of precision airstrikes and deep incursions has brought them closer than ever to a line that no one can afford to cross. The more routine the aggression, the thinner the margin for error. And in a region where historical trauma, religious polarization, and great power rivalry intersect, error isn't just possible, it's inevitable. So perhaps the more important question isn't, who started it? Or, who will strike next? Perhaps it's this. How many more close calls does the world get before one of them isn't just close, but final? If you value this perspective, consider subscribing to Worldview today and sharing it with someone who still believes in critical thinking.